Hello and welcome to the equine functional therapy anatomy class. In this video, we will be looking at the basic anatomy of the cervical spine, including the different shapes and sizes of each vertebrae and why they're formed that way. A horse has 7 cervical vertebrae, simply named C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. Here we have the wing of C1, which can easily be seen and felt on your own horse. Then we come around to the back of the vertebrae, the caudal side, and then the ventral surface, where we can see just how thin the bone of the atlas wing really is. As we look at the cranial aspect of C1, we can see how there is uneven wear on the articular fovea, as these are the surfaces that make up the atlanto-occipital joint when the C1 is placed into the occipital condyles of the skull. Studies have shown that a horse can move their head up and down 90 degrees simply from the atlanto-occipital junction. C1 is also known as the Atlas, named after the Greek god who was condemned to support the earth and heavens on his shoulders. C2 is also called the Axis, so named because the atlas rotates around the odontoid process. In an equine skeleton, we simply call this the dens. This joint between the atlas and axis allows for the rotation of the head. The dens is the rounded tongue that you can see pointing straight towards the camera here. As we come to the back, or the caudal side of the axis, you can see the vertebral fossa, the socket into which the ball joint from C3 will sit. Then the long ventral crest on the bottom of the vertebrae, and the small transverse process on the side. So let's have a closer look at the atlantoaxial joint. This is where the dens inserts into the fovea of the atlas. Researchers found that this joint is capable of 110 degrees of rotation. Comparatively, there's no more than 5 degrees of rotation between any other 2 vertebrae. This joint is also capable of 15 degrees of flexion and extension. C3, C4 and C5 are somewhat similar in composition, with cranial and caudal articular processes, a flat and wide spinous process, and long transverse processes for stabilizing muscle connections. The major difference between these 3 bones is their width. C3 is quite narrow, C4 wider and longer, and C5 the largest of the cervical vertebrae. This transverse process of C5 can actually be externally palpated. You can see here the difference in width of C3 on the left as compared to C5 on the right. Where C3 is quite narrow, C5 has much wider transverse processes. We can see that the ventral crest of C4 and C5 drop down quite dramatically. These vertebrae were not meant to be aligned along a table in a completely horizontal line. They're perfectly designed to attach and support musculature from the elevated head down into the thoracic sling. Once again, we can see quite a large vertebral fossa, the socket into which the vertebral head of the following vertebra will sit. We can also see an irregularity to the left caudal articular process, with a slight ridge having formed on the lateral edge. The large hole in the middle of the vertebra is called the vertebral foramen, through which the spinal cord flows. Both transverse foramen can be seen. They're the small holes either side of the vertebral foramen. These carry vertebral vessels and nerves. C6 and C7 are both unique in shape. C6 has enlarged ventral tubercles. And it is clear to see that the 6th cervical vertebrae is reducing in size when compared to the 5th cervical vertebrae, both in width and length. C6 also begins to have a more prominent spinous process. In C7, we see the spinous process grow larger again, despite the fact that this is the smallest of the cervical vertebrae. C7 is somewhat of a transitional vertebrae, meaning that it has characteristics of both a cervical vertebrae with prominent articular processes and a thoracic vertebrae, having articulating surfaces for the first ribs. We can see here how C6 and C7 fit together, with the articular processes gliding over the top of each other. It's also easy to see that if the horse has poor posture or musculature, it's possible for these vertebrae to come into quite extreme compression. Because the atlas and axis both sit quite high in the neck and close in proximity to the nuchal ligament, both vertebrae are topped with a nuchal bursa, a fluid-filled sac to help reduce friction and promote free movement. The cranial nuchal bursa over the top of the atlas and the caudal nuchal bursa over the axis. The spinal processes of C2 through 5 provide rough connective surfaces for the lamellar portion of the nuchal ligament. It is quite common for modern sport horses to be lacking lamellar connections to C6 and C7, although there are always exceptions to the rule. These 7 bones play an important role in the locomotion of the horse. They assist in the transfer of movement from the hind end to the front and provide all-important movement of the head. The unique composition of atlas and axis provide the ability to reach and twist with the head, and the ball and socket joints of the lower cervical provide a great range of motion. Articular processes aid in stabilizing the vertebrae and creating a beautiful interlocking system.